Beneath the quiet streets of Wichita, a seemingly ordinary man harbored a dark fantasy for decades, meticulously planning and executing a series of chilling crimes, leaving a trail of terror and an enigma that would haunt a nation, until a single arrogant mistake brought his carefully constructed world crashing down. Wichita, Kansas, the Heartland. A place defined by its gentle rhythms, the slow, predictable clockwork of American life, the drone of summer cicadas that acts as nature's own white noise, the whisper of wind through the tall prairie grass, a sound so constant it ceases to be noticed. Days that melted into weeks, then years, marked by an absolute, almost sacred adherence to routine. School bells, church hymns, the predictable choreography of neighborly existence. Ordinary lives lived in ordinary houses on ordinary streets. This was the landscape of profound trust. A trust, implicit and unspoken, that the boundaries of safety were clearly defined, that the veneer of normalcy was a shield. Every morning, the ritual of the newspaper on the porch. Every evening, the comforting thud of a locked door. A life built on the assumption of continuity, that life would unfold as it always had, that the shadows would remain outside, in the alley, behind the hedges, where they belonged. But sometimes, in the deepest quiet of the heartland, a different kind of silence breeds. A chilling quiet that is not born of peace, but of anticipation, of watching, of studying, of a meticulous mind mapping the vulnerabilities inherent in simply trusting. A silence that isn't empty, but pregnant with an unseen, methodical presence. For decades, a darkness moved among them, a shadow cloaked in the most powerful form of camouflage, the mundane. This phantom understood the language of routine better than anyone. It knew the precise moment the street lights dimmed. It cataloged the hours a husband was away at work, the frequency of a neighbor's dog bark. It saw the unlocked side window, the routine of the late-night television, the small, almost imperceptible habits that make up a human life. And in that quiet, deliberate observation, a chilling design began to take shape. Not quickly, not with explosive, irrational violence, but with a creeping, insidious dread, building, refining, and testing its boundaries in the most secret corners of the mind, long before it ever touched the world outside. This individual lived two lives. One was the life of civic duty, of family obligation, of compliance. A life measured in committee meetings and stern, yet respected, neighborhood presence. The other life was an internal domain, a fortress of perverse fantasy where control was absolute and the power of life and death was reserved solely for him. The two worlds were kept entirely separate, secured by a wall of psychological dissociation that was the cornerstone of his survival and his ultimate reign of terror. He was a master of patience. He could wait. He could watch. He could plan for months, even years, refining the script, anticipating every police response, every media headline. His attacks were not frenzied. They were meticulous theatrical productions, where he was the writer, the director, and the sole actor of power. The purpose was not merely the final act, but the process leading up to it, the stalking, the intrusion, the complete psychological subjection of his chosen target. The terror he instilled was a perverse form of artistic expression, his signature, the initials BTK, a narcissistic declaration of authorship. The true horror of Wichita was the realization that the perpetrator was not an outsider. He was the man who waved across the street, the man who sat 2 pews over in church. He wore the armor of normalcy and in doing so became functionally invisible. This documentary is the forensic dissection of that invisibility, the psychological rise, the horrific expression, and the inevitable, catastrophic fall of the man who called himself bind, torture, kill. the quiet dread has a name. We begin the descent.
Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button. I've got stories that'll keep you thinking. Stick with me.
Before the Phantom, there was just Dennis. Born Dennis Lynn Rader in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, his early existence was steeped in the rigid moral code of the conservative Midwest. He was the eldest of 4 children, a position that often brings responsibility and, in his case, an early sense of stern obligation. The Rader household, like many in the region, was marked by a strict adherence to faith. This upbringing emphasized conformity, obedience, and the suppression of inconvenient emotion. Displaying vulnerability or seeking deep, reciprocal emotional connection was often viewed as a weakness, a deviation from the prescribed path of piety. In this atmosphere, a quiet, introverted child like Dennis began to internalize his feelings, finding no safe harbor for the turmoil that was beginning to brew within. What he experienced was emotional neglect, not necessarily physical deprivation, but a deep, aching void where genuine connection should have been. The emphasis was always on doing the right thing, on maintaining the appearance of respectability, rather than being present. The consequence for young Dennis was a profound sense of isolation. He learned early that his inner life was his own to cultivate, without interference or judgment from the external world. This isolation was the essential ingredient in the creation of his alter ego. The innate human desire for control, denied a healthy outlet, began to twist into something darker. Where he could not control his parents' affections or his social standing, he sought mastery in the only place available, his private fantasies. These were not the innocent flights of a child's imagination. They were intricate, commanding scenarios centered on dominance, on the absolute power to dictate another's actions, to render them helpless. His school years were defined by his lack of close, authentic bonds. He was a presence, but never a focal point. An average student, his social interactions were perfunctory. He was adept at the outward mechanics of friendship, the small talk, the shared activities, but incapable of the intimacy that forges true connection. This lack of profound peer bonding further cemented his internal isolation. He was a spectator in his own life, constantly observing, but never truly participating. After high school, Rader briefly attended college before enlisting in the United States Air Force in 1966, serving a 4-year tour. The military provided a strange comfort, absolute structure, ironclad rules, and a clear chain of command. This environment, where control was external and absolute, perhaps temporarily satisfied his need for order. It reinforced his own methodical nature and his ability to follow directives, traits that would later be weaponized in his planning. Upon his return to Kansas, Rader married Paula Dietz in 1971 and began the outward process of building a conventional life. A college degree, a job, a family. He was constructing the perfect facade, the ultimate defensive mechanism against suspicion. But beneath the surface of this new, established routine, the fantasies had not subsided. They had matured, growing more urgent, more insistent. The mask of the good citizen, so carefully placed, began to feel less like a performance and more like a permanent skin. The psychological split was complete. The quiet, repressed boy from Pittsburgh was now a man in Wichita, and the dark identity he had incubated in silence was ready to demand expression. The rise was complete. The psychological descent was about to become physical reality. Chapter 2 takes us into the labyrinthine mind of Dennis Rader, the essential core of his entire criminal existence. This is not the study of a transient madness, but a meticulous, decades-long psychological project. At the foundation of Rader's pathology was an almost psychotic need for absolute control and dominance. This wasn't merely about the final act of violence. It was about the power dynamic. Rader saw himself as a psychological chess master and his victims as pawns. The thrill lay in the total subjection, the removal of all agency from another human being. He used the physical acts of binding and torture as tools to achieve this psychological victory. They were methods to amplify his feeling of omnipotence, proving to himself that he was capable of exerting profound, ultimate control over life itself. The maintenance of the public mask, the pillar of the community, the church council president, the Cub Scout leader, was not a burden for Rader. It was a psychological requirement. He achieved a state of profound psychological dissociation. The Dennis Rader who went to work and family picnics was a separate entity from BTK, the architect of terror. He didn't just act normal, he was normal in those roles. This split allowed him to function without the crippling guilt or fear that would have halted a less psychologically compartmentalized individual. He created a psychological vault, sealing away the monster so that the ordinary man could live without interruption. The monster only emerged when the circumstances were perfect and the mask was securely off. Rader was an obsessive ritualist. His crimes were not spontaneous, they were projects, a term he used himself. He would spend months trolling or stalking potential victims, studying their routines, their entries and exits, their vulnerabilities. His planning was meticulous, extending to contingency routes, police response times, and methods of post-event emotional processing. He often carried a kit, a collection of implements for binding and maintaining control, reinforcing the ritualistic, almost ceremonial nature of the attacks. The moniker, bind, torture, kill, was itself a ritualistic sequence, a code of conduct he applied to every scenario, lending structure and meaning to his terrifying acts. The creation of the BTK identity was an act of extreme narcissism. The man who felt emotionally neglected and invisible in his youth sought global recognition for his power. The initials were his badge of honor, his signature on his work. When he sent letters to the media, he wasn't trying to be caught. He was attempting to manage his own legend. His greatest fear was not prison, but being ignored. He viewed the investigation as a personal competition, a game of wits between himself and the authorities. His ego was so vast and so fragile that it required constant validation through the media attention his crimes generated. His need to be smarter than them fueled the compulsion to communicate, which would ultimately become his fatal flaw. The repressive religious background of his youth played a critical role. The suppression of natural sexual and emotional drives resulted in a transference of repression into power fantasy. The rigid rules of his faith demanded outward purity, forcing his darker desires into absolute secrecy. This secrecy became a source of perverse thrill. The fact that he could sit in a church service, lead a group of young scouts, or pass a compliance audit, all while harboring the identity of one of the nation's most feared serial killers, was his ultimate psychological achievement, a constant, private victory over the morality he was forced to outwardly profess. The lengthy dormancy between his crimes, years of apparent inactivity, puzzled investigators. For Rader, these were not periods of recovery, but of necessary psychological maintenance. He described his compulsion as a demon, a factor that he had to suppress when life's external demands, job pressure, family stress, became too high. But the factor was never truly dormant. During these silent periods, Rader was often engaged in fantasy substitution, spending hours refining his memories of past attacks, planning future scenarios, and maintaining his elaborate kit. The absence of a physical crime simply meant the psychological theater was running at full volume, allowing him to recharge the fantasy until the external pressure of the urge became irresistible. He was a collector of fear, and he required time to savor the impact of his previous actions before demanding a new supply. This methodical pacing gave him the longevity that made him such an enduring, terrifying figure. Rader's mind was a closed circuit of pathological needs, control leading to secrecy, secrecy fueling narcissism, and narcissism demanding public recognition, all contained within the impenetrable wall of dissociation. He did not lose control, he lived for it. And in that icy calculation, he achieved a level of sustained terror few could match.
If you've made it this far, you're my kind of viewer. Tap like, hit subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.
The period from 1974 to 1991 represents the operational phase of the BTK phenomenon. It is a timeline marked by calculated intrusion, extreme vulnerability, and the terrorizing manipulation of an entire city. The terror began with a devastating eruption in 1974. The Otero family, Joseph, Julie, and their children Josephine and Joseph Jr., represented the first victims of the constructed BTK fantasy. Rader later confessed that he had planned for weeks specifically targeting their home due to a perceived vulnerability and ease of access. His method was to present himself as a stranded repairman. The goal of this initial intrusion was total psychological subjection achieved through overwhelming force and speed. Rader's process was ritualistic. Upon gaining entry, the victims were immediately restrained using materials he had brought. This physical restriction was the key element of his dominance fantasy. The ensuing ordeal was characterized by Rader controlling every moment, dictating actions, and prolonging the state of helplessness before ultimately ending the lives of all 4 family members. The scene was left deliberately and methodically chaotic to send a message to the police. This established the core pattern of his signature: the use of binding, the establishment of total power, and the final act of extinguishing life. Just a few months later, the attack on 21-year-old Catherine Bright and her brother, Kevin Bright, demonstrated Rader's evolving confidence. The home invasion, while tragically concluding in Catherine's death, was notable for its aftermath. Rader, desperate for the credit he believed he deserved for the Otero crimes, began his correspondence with the authorities, leaving a note inside a technical manual at the library that confessed to the Otero murders. This act marked his transition from a silent killer to the self-proclaimed identity of BTK. He needed the world to know what he had done, ensuring his personal psychological triumph was recognized publicly. Shirley Vian was targeted in 1977. This crime demonstrated Rader's ability to invade a home while children were present, reinforcing the disturbing depth of his planning and psychological detachment. The attack on Vian was followed by Rader's first letter directly to the media, an act of open defiance and taunting. This letter established the name BTK and laid out his chilling criteria: bind, torture, kill, cementing his narrative in the public consciousness. The letters were his trophies, his way of maintaining control over the investigation's focus. The murder of Nancy Fox later that year provided a terrifying glimpse into the escalation of Rader's ego. After ensuring her complete subjection, he left her life extinguished, then called the police himself from a phone booth to report a murder in the area. This was the ultimate expression of his need for control and observation, reporting his own crime to watch the immediate consequences of his actions unfold. He inserted himself directly into the investigation, a high-stakes, narcissistic gamble that succeeded. The late 1970s and early 1980s were marked by further communications, but a temporary halt in physical crimes, a result of the intense public fear and police activity that his earlier actions had generated. However, the urge returned in 1985 with the murder of Maureen Hedge, followed by Vicki Wegerle in 1986. These later attacks maintained his signature of intrusion, restriction, and termination of life, proving his long-term compulsion was intact. Rader's ability to strike with precision, then vanish into his ordinary life, was unparalleled. He was living the perfect double life, maintaining control in both the public eye and his private domain. Dolores Davis, targeted and taken from her home in 1991, was the final victim whose life Rader extinguished before his long dormancy. Her body was discovered later, carefully positioned, confirming Rader's need for final control over the scene. This crime marked the end of the physical terror, the end of the first act of the BTK story. The city breathed a tentative sigh of relief, believing the killer had retired or moved on. Rader simply reverted to his period of cooling off, his fantasies maintained through private rituals and recollections. The investigation struggled for decades. Rader's victim selection was diverse in age and social status, confusing initial attempts at profiling. His long periods of silence made the case go cold, only to be resurrected by a new crime or a taunting letter. He was a non-starter for many early profiles because he lacked the typical transient nature of many serial killers. He was settled, married, employed. This confounding stability was his greatest defense. The collective fear in Wichita was a constant undercurrent, the awareness that the killer was an ordinary citizen among them, making the neighbor next door the object of uneasy suspicion. Rader thrived on this chaos and manipulation, feeding his ego with the knowledge that he was the most feared, yet least suspected, man in the city. The terror was comprehensive, spanning 17 years of calculated psychological warfare. After a 13-year period of absolute silence, the final act of the BTK drama began to unfold in the early 2000s. It was a slow, meticulous unraveling, driven not by the brilliance of the hunter, but by the fatal, self-destructive arrogance of the hunted. In 2004, Dennis Rader, now comfortable, perhaps bored, and certainly desperate for renewed validation, broke his long silence. He began sending a new series of taunting communications. These were not the simple typewritten notes of the 70s. These were packages, letters, and objects left in public places, including jewelry stolen from his earlier victims. This sudden, inexplicable need to reassert his identity signaled the beginning of his end. The terror was back, but the technology of the world had changed irrevocably. Rader, testing the boundaries of the digital age, sent a letter to police in 2005 asking if he could communicate with them using a computer floppy disk without being traced. He sought assurance from the very authorities he had spent decades manipulating. This was the zenith of his narcissistic hubris. The police, led by Detective Ken Landwehr, played their hand brilliantly. They placed a coded ad in the Wichita Eagle, informing the writer that, yes, the disk would be safe. A calculated, necessary lie designed to lure him further out of the shadows. Rader took the bait. In February 2005, he sent a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk to a local Fox affiliate. The disk contained a document about the planned attack on a young woman and instructions for his tombstone. The police, having gained possession of the disk, were meticulous. While the document was seemingly anonymous, they discovered that Rader had failed to understand a crucial element of modern computing: metadata. Investigators examined the digital file's properties. Embedded within the file was a hidden layer of information, the metadata, which indicated that the document was last saved or modified by a user named Dennis and was created within the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, Kansas. This was the definitive crack in the BTK fortress. Decades of meticulous planning, camouflage, and psychological evasion were undone by 3 pieces of digital information that Rader, the genius planner, failed to erase or comprehend. The investigation immediately narrowed to Park City, focusing on members of the Christ Lutheran Church named Dennis. They quickly identified Dennis Lynn Rader, a church council president, a compliance officer for the city, and a family man. The profile fit the geographical area, the church link, and the bizarre duality of a public life versus the hidden killer. The final, irrefutable link was DNA. A search warrant was obtained to collect a DNA sample from Rader's daughter, discreetly collected from a pap smear she had taken at a university medical facility. The sample was a familial match to the DNA retrieved from the seminal fluid on a stocking left at one of the 1986 crime scenes. The confluence of digital, biographical, and forensic evidence was overwhelming. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was apprehended near his home in Park City. As plainclothes officers surrounded his vehicle, the seemingly ordinary man, the pillar of the community, quietly submitted. The psychological split he had maintained for 30 years was finally, violently breached. The interrogation was one of the most chilling documented events in criminal history. Rader, without counsel and in his characteristic, meticulous, detached manner, systematically confessed to every crime. He spoke of the victims as projects. He detailed the binding methods, the restraints, the exact sequence of events, his post-crime rituals, and his internal thought process. He described his trolling like a meticulous scientist describing fieldwork. The police did not have to lead him. He was driven by the narcissistic urge to finally tell his whole story to an audience he could not control. His decades of silence were replaced by an overwhelming torrent of cold, factual disclosure. Facing overwhelming evidence and having confessed on record, Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom segment of his trial was surreal. During his formal statement, Rader stood before the court and read an extended, detailed confession describing the details of his crimes with the same emotionless cadence he might have used to recite a church bulletin. He showed no discernible remorse, only a detached, almost clinical acknowledgement of his actions. This lack of empathy was the final confirmation of his profound psychological distance from the suffering he had inflicted. In August 2005, Judge Gregory Waller sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences, a total of 175 years, ensuring he would never again walk free. Dennis Rader remains incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. The ultimate control freak lives in a world where every minute of his day is dictated by prison rules, stripped of the freedom and power he craved. His arrogance, the very foundation of his psychological life, led him to believe he could defeat the march of technology and the persistence of law enforcement. His ego demanded an audience. His ego delivered him to justice. The final, painful irony is that the need for recognition, which defined his life as BTK, became the very mechanism of his downfall. We pause the narrative of the killer. The shadow he cast was long, but it is necessary to remember that the center of this story is not his mind or his methods, but the innocent lives he extinguished and the families he irrevocably destroyed. He manufactured fear. They suffered reality. Joseph and Julie Otero and their children, Josephine and Joseph Jr. A family unit violently fractured in their own sanctuary. Their lives, hopes, and futures were taken in the most brutal of intrusions. Catherine Bright, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, a loss that catalyzed the realization of the danger in Wichita. Shirley Vian, a mother whose life was taken while her young children were present, a tragedy that instilled deep, lasting psychological scars in her family and community. Nancy Fox, her death was announced by the killer himself, a chilling act of manipulation that showcased his desire to control even the immediate public response. Maureen Hedge, a neighbor, a life targeted and taken during a period of fear and tension. Vicki Wegerly, her murder showed that the killer was still operational, still stalking, still ready to return to his dark compulsion. Dolores Davis, the last known life taken, a final act of terror before the long, deceptive silence. These 10 individuals were unique. They were beloved. They were essential pieces of the fabric of their community. Their memory must transcend the sensational details of their passing. They represent the profound human cost of evil hiding in plain sight. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, friends and colleagues. They are the truth of the BTK story. They are remembered. The BTK case is not merely a solved mystery. It is a profound lesson in the nature of concealed depravity. The monster was not a shadowy figure from the distant edge of society. He was the man who adhered meticulously to every societal expectation. He proved that the greatest capacity for evil can often be found beneath the heaviest layer of conventionality. Dennis Rader's existence was a controlled experiment in the danger of unchecked ego. For 30 years, his narcissism sustained him, convincing him that he was an uncatchable genius. His meticulous planning was overshadowed by a greater, more primal need: the need for credit, for recognition. His eventual downfall was not due to a lapse in his operational security, but a lapse in his ego control. He could not tolerate being ignored, and in his desperate bid to reinsert himself into the narrative, he gave the police the singular, digital key they needed to dismantle his entire life. The cost of his psychological silence was staggering: decades of fear, a community's broken trust, and 10 extinguished lives. The story of BTK will forever stand as a chilling archetype of the secret life, the profound schism between the public persona and the hidden psychological compulsion. It is the story of a man who managed to live a lie so perfectly, he managed to fool himself, leading him into a final act of hubris that extinguished his freedom forever. Wichita has healed, but the scar remains. It is the understanding that the most terrifying presence can be the most ordinary, that the quietest person in the room can harbor the most spectacular violence. And as we conclude the account of Dennis Rader, the final, persistent dread is this: his story is over, but the quiet rhythm of the ordinary world continues. And somewhere, perhaps, another man, driven by the same profound need for control and the same corrosive silence, may be watching and waiting. You've just watched Downfall: Inside the Criminal Mind. Coming next, Albert Fish, the man who ate his victims. A story of deception, control, and the monster behind the mask.
Tell me what moment hit you the hardest. Drop your thoughts below and don't forget to like and subscribe. More stories are coming.